Well, good morning to everybody. I'm so thankful we can be together. I'm thankful you're all here this morning and no one came in too late or anything like that. Last night, was daylight savings time, and I'm telling you this much, I hate time change. I don't care whether we're springing forward or falling back. For the next week or so, I will just be sluggish. It doesn't really make a difference. My biological clock has to do a reset twice a year, and quite honestly, I just wish that we would just not even mess with it. I wish we would just get honestly into I guess this time is the right one, I'm not really sure, but I wish we would get into this one and just leave it. I like the extra daylight in the spring and summer to be outside a little bit longer, but I'll tell you, we get a little bit sluggish around this time, and I'm just thankful to be able to be together with you this morning and be able to worship together. I don't know if you know this or not, but our theme this year is Love Your Neighbor. Have y'all heard that that's what the theme is? We've been trying to introduce that, been trying to preach some sermons that center around us on this theme, and I hope that you've gotten the message, and I hope that you've been challenged over the past several weeks with this theme and with this thought of trying to love your neighbor. It is a challenge. I'm so thankful that over the next for the next several months, I think the last one will be in October, but in the next few months, I will be able to have the opportunity to preach to you sermons that talk about talking to your neighbor. And I'm really excited about this because, we want to try to be evangelistic. And if I love my neighbor, then I'm going to share the gospel with my neighbor. And so over the next several months, there'll be one sprinkled here and there that will talk about how to talk to your neighbor. Just remind us about our evangelistic efforts, because there's some things about talking to my neighbor that actually bring us, maybe some barriers, some hindrances. And really it's these differences that we have. We all don't see things the same exact way. It's just the way things are. And I've got several neighbors around me. Matter of fact, I've got one set of neighbors that go to church here. They're literally across the street from me, the Platts. And we, even with the Platts, there are some differences between us. That's just the nature of it. That's just who we are as people. But when we're talking about your neighbors, we're not talking about literally the people that live across the street from you or next to you. When we talk about neighbors, we're talking about people that we just know, right? That are in our community, people that I work with, people that I go to school with, or people that I hang out with. Just really anybody that I may meet or greet in this community, in this world, that's who is my neighbor. That's what I think the scriptures tell us, and that's the challenge that we have today at North Heights. How do I talk to people who are my neighbors all over this community and all over the world? There are differences, but you know what? These differences can be managed. We can handle these, but we've got to talk about those things. So that's what we're going to face. All these differences that we have, how do I talk to my neighbor who is different than me in some aspect or another? And I think that this is such a relevant topic because in our world today, we're constantly noticing those differences between me and somebody else. Our country right now is extremely divided over fill in the blank. We can just fill in the blank, and we know there's going to be differences. There's differences right here in our own congregation at North Heights. Differences of opinions on all kinds of things. How do we talk to our neighbor? How do we talk to people that we love, that we want to share the gospel with, even when they're different than me? Now, this morning, we're going to specifically talk about how do I talk to my neighbor who sins differently than me? And this is a great challenge. It's a great challenge because there are some differences in the way that maybe I sin and maybe somebody else sins. I can easily come through there and list all these sins that maybe I'm guilty of, maybe anger and bitterness and boasting and cussing and pride and lying and judging and greed and complaining and envy. And I think, wow, these are my sins. But boy, I look over at my neighbor and my neighbor is guilty of all kinds of other sins. And I think that my neighbor's sins are worse than my sins. I look at my neighbor and thinking, oh, he's guilty of hatred and adultery and rioting and homosexuality and stealing stealing and violence and lusting and promiscuity and unbelief and fornication. These are the worst sins anyway. That's what my neighbor is guilty of. And so it challenges me for me to talk to my neighbor because I loved him so much. It challenges me to talk to my neighbor and try to tell them about the gospel when I think that maybe their sins are a little worse than my sins. But really, that's not the way that this works. What we really find is that these sins are equal. These sins are the same thing. There's no difference whatsoever. I want you to turn over to the book of James, and I want us to look at this passage because I want to show you how the way that God views sins. Because the way sometimes I view sin or we view sin is maybe different than the way that God does. And there is a difference, and we'll notice that here in just a moment. But James chapter 2 in verse 10, James writes and says, "For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. For he who said, 'Do not commit adultery,' also said, 'Do not murder.' If you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law." And so just notice this. In one point is what he says. You may keep the law in all kinds of great aspect, but there's this one point that you have failed in. Well, if you have failed in one of those points, one of those sins, if you've made one of those mistakes, then you are guilty. You are accountable for every aspect of it. Let's just make a quick little application. Let's just pick lying, okay? Maybe you're guilty of lying. All of us, honestly, are probably guilty of lying. You could probably look at that list that I put up there, and you could think, well, I don't know, Alex, I'm not really guilty of any of those things. And I'm telling you, if you think that you're not guilty of any of those sins that were on that list earlier, then you're lying. And so therefore you are now guilty of those very things. And if you are, then guess what? The Bible tells us that if you're guilty of one of those things, you are guilty of every aspect of them. You are accountable on every aspect. Because why? Well, He tells us in James chapter 2 that he who said also said. He who said. Now we know who the he is, right? Because we know the context. He says, he who said, "Do not commit adultery." Who is it that said, "Do not commit adultery"? Well, God did. If you remember back in Exodus chapter 20, when He gives the 10 Commandments to Moses, all of Israel is gathered around this mountain, and Moses is up on this mountain and receiving the 10 Commandments. And with God's own finger, He's writing out these commands and giving them to the people of Israel. One of those is do not commit adultery. Another one is do not murder. So when He says, he who said, it's God that said that. He's the person that we're trying to please. He's the one that we're trying to meet His standards. It is He who said, "Do not commit adultery." And He also said this. So you can't say, well, I'm not guilty of this one, but I'm guilty of this one. It's all the same. Let's break it down a little bit further. Look at verse 11 with me in a little bit more detail, and let's fill in the blanks. It says, "For he who said, do not," and here we go. You ready? Fill in the blank. Let's just put your neighbor's sin right here. Your neighbor's sin. Do not, whatever your neighbor may be guilty of. But He also said, and now you fill in the blank, and you put your sin. You put your sin. But if you do not, and you put your neighbor's sin here. But do, and you put your sin here. Well, guess what? What's the outcome of all this? Well, he who said that you're guilty of this, you're also guilty of this. He says you have become a transgressor of the law. You've broken the law. All of it. The point is that it doesn't make any difference about what sin it is or how one sin is a different sin than this sin. And yeah, sure, maybe I'm not this, but I'm definitely that. Well, it doesn't make any difference. If you can pick out one sin, if your sin was up there at all, and you can just find any sin, even if it's not up there, a sin, a transgression, a missing of the mark of God, well, then you're guilty of every aspect of it. But you know what? What we do a lot of times is we start thinking, well, this sin is worse than this one. And you know what? It's interesting because there is some differences. Different sins, some sins have harsher consequences than others. We know that. You know, honestly, when you think about the sin of lying, somebody can lie and it doesn't have the same kind of consequence. We're not throwing people in jail over every single little white lie that someone gives. someone tells some kind of a lie. We're not putting them straight into jail. But if you murder, you're going to be held accountable for that. And especially if you're caught and you've murdered somebody, you're going to be in jail. Maybe even executed because of your sin. So we know there is a difference between some sins. We understand that the consequences can be different from one sin to the next. Sometimes sins affect more people or people in general where other sins may not. Sometimes you may have the sin of pride or arrogance and it really doesn't affect somebody else. That's something that you could have within yourself, and maybe you don't impact somebody else because of that sin in your life. But there are other sins where you've committed these things and it affects all kinds of people. It hurts all kinds of people. You think about the sin of adultery, the sin of homosexuality. Those kinds of sins can sometimes affect everybody. It can affect an entire community. The sin of murder, absolutely a part of that. It affects a lot of people, and those consequences are different. But that doesn't mean that it's not as worse of a sin, or God doesn't view it as a worse sin. All of them are the same. They're all the same. It makes no difference whatsoever. Why? Because Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, he says, "For all have sinned." All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That word "all" means that there's no exclusion. No one gets to say, well, I'm not included in this description of the all. Everyone has sinned and they fall short of the glory of God. This word sin is very interesting. It's a word that means that you have missed the mark. There's a standard that God is expecting from you and you can't meet that standard. Okay? That's a sin. In other words, God is wanting you to hit the bullseye and you aim and you shoot and you miss the mark. You've missed the mark. That's a sin. God is expecting this and you came short. That's why he says, and fall short of the glory of God. The other word for sin is trespass. That means that God has set up a boundary and that you've crossed over that boundary. He says, do not do this, and you've removed yourself from that boundary and put yourself on the other side of it. And still, that's all still a sin because you're not meeting God's standards. So trespassing is sin because God is expecting you to stay within that boundary and you've removed yourself out of it. The outcome is that you fall short of the glory of God. God is, because it is He who said and also said those sins. It is His standard. It is His glory that we're trying to meet and to match and trying to attain. And when we sin, we can't get there. We fall short of the glory of God, fall short of being in His presence. And we're looking to get there, but we constantly sin. And every single person is guilty of it. Sure, different consequences, but everybody is guilty of it. So now, how? With this in mind, how? How do I talk to my neighbor who sins differently than me? They have different sins than me. Sure, everybody's guilty of it all, and different sins have different consequences, but it is different. How do I talk to my neighbor who sins differently than me? I want to give you four points this morning. 2 don'ts in talking to your neighbor, and 2 do's in talking to your neighbor. Such an easy sermon. Are you ready? It's so easy. First of all, don't talk to your neighbor with a holier-than-thou attitude. If you don't mind, go ahead and turn over in your Bibles to the book of Luke. We're going to look at the first 2 points will come both from the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. First of all, go over to Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18. And we'll see what Jesus says about this kind of holier-than-thou attitude. You have to remember, Jesus is telling these people all about the coming kingdom. He's just healed the 10 lepers, and he's telling them all about the coming kingdom, and he takes the opportunity for them to learn a lesson about prayer. And he tells them a parable about a persistent widow in the very beginning of the chapter. A widow who is looking for legal counsel, and so she knocks on the door of this lawyer constantly, and he turns her away, but she keeps coming back and knocking on the door, and finally the lawyer goes ahead and gives in and is going to represent this woman in her legal matter. And Jesus says that that's the kind of prayer life that you need to have with God. That's the lesson behind that. He says this in verse 7. It says, "And will not God give justice to his elect who cry to him day and night?" That's a rhetorical question. The answer is yes. God is going to listen to them. If we go ahead and cry out to him, he will listen. Another rhetorical question Jesus asks. He says, "Will he delay long over them?" Will he delay long over them? No, he won't. He won't hold back. He'll answer it, and he'll answer it soon in his own time. Then in verse 8, Jesus says this, "But I tell you that he will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless," and I love this one right here, another rhetorical question, but one that the people answer. And I know they answer by the way that Jesus responds to them. Here's the rhetorical question. "Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" Will he find faith on earth? And I think that these disciples that are listening to this lesson are saying, well, absolutely. Obviously, God is going to find faith on earth. Look at me. I am faithful. I am good. I am righteous. God's going to find faith on earth because of who I am. I've made it. I've done all these great things. I think that that's the attitude in which these people answer this question within their own minds. I don't think anybody actually answered it. We don't have it in the text. Maybe they did. But Jesus, understanding that, responds to them in a certain way. And I want you to notice this. Starting in verse 9 of Luke chapter 18. It says this, "And he also told this parable to some," here it is, "who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt." So I think that question, will God find faithfulness? Will he find faith on earth? The people started answering it within their own heads. And Jesus knew it because he's God, and he begins to tell them another parable. He begins to tell them another parable because they start trusting in themselves. This word trust is an important word. It's found all throughout the Scriptures. And what it means is that we are to persuade or to convince. Sometimes you do this in a positive way. Here it's talking about a negative way. You trust in God, or you convince yourself that God is going to be faithful to you. Trust and faith go hand in hand a lot of times. We sing a song, don't we? Trust and obey. There is no other way, right? We understand that if I'm going to trust in God, that I'm going to have faith in him. So you begin to convince or persuade yourself that God is faithful to you and you will be faithful to him. And therefore you live your lives. Now here in this context, this word trust is not in a positive light. They start trusting, he says, in themselves. They begin to persuade or to convince themselves of something. Okay? And we do this all the time, don't we? We do this, you start thinking, well, I'm going to go ahead and have this cosmic brownie because, hey, you know what, I deserve it. I'm going to convince myself it's okay. I'll eat this cosmic brownie and it ain't going to hurt me anything. I've already been working outside a whole bunch today. And so you persuade yourself that it's good for you to do this. We do this all the time in our lives. We start convincing ourselves. All right, well here these people are convincing and persuading themselves. But what they're persuading themselves on is that they are righteous. Notice what he says. Trusted in themselves that they were righteous. And this word righteous means that they are in accordance with a high standard. They are upright, correct, or innocent. Okay, and there's such great examples all throughout Scripture of people who are righteous. Abraham was a man who was righteous. Job was a man who was righteous. They were upright. They were innocent. No, they made mistakes, but they were trying to meet this high standard. And the way that they became righteous is not of themselves, but they became righteous because God made them righteous. God is in control of that. Here, these people are thinking, will God find faith on earth? Well, yeah, he will, because look at me. I'm faithful. I'm good. I'm innocent. I've convinced myself of my innocence. That's the problem. And then he goes on to say, and they treated others with contempt. This word, treated others with contempt, this phrase is actually one word in the Greek language, in the original language. One word. We have to translate it with many to get the concept behind us. But they treated others with contempt. And what that means is that they are displaying an attitude to treat others as if they are worthless. They are beneath you, or they are worthy of this mistreatment. That's what they were doing wrong. So, Jesus understands this in their minds when they hear it, and he begins to tell them a parable. Notice what he says. He says, two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and one a tax collector. He's already set the stage for two characters, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And I'm sure they're already making judgments in their mind about who these people really are. So Jesus begins to say, the Pharisee who knows the law of God, that's their job. That's who they are. They are lawyers in the law of God. They know it. So the Pharisee is standing by himself and prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. This Pharisee begins to make a list of sins, like what we did a minute ago. And he's saying, boy, I'm glad I'm not like this guy over here. I'm glad I'm not like my neighbor. I'm glad I'm not like this man over here. I'm not like that. I don't know. I picture this tax collector standing back here and the Pharisee just about talking to God, and he just about points over there at this tax collector. He goes on to say in verse 12, he says, I fast twice a week, and I tithe, or I give a tenth of all that I have. Well, Jesus goes on to say, but the tax collector, standing afar off, there he is back there. Y'all can see him, right? He's standing back there in your mind's eye. He would not even lift up his eyes. Wouldn't even lift up his eyes. Instead, he begins to beat his breast, beating on his chest. You know what I'm talking about. You know what that means. And he starts saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Oh, I've made mistakes. I've cheated people. That's what tax collectors were known for. They may still be known for that. I don't know. I'm a sinner. Jesus says this in verse 14. I tell you, this man went to his house. Which man? The tax collector. This man went away to his house justified. The word justified means as if he had never sinned. Goes away as if he had never sinned. Rather than the other, the Pharisee. Jesus then says, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Such important words here to understand. I think it's so interesting how this man says, I thank you that I am not like these other men. I'm so thankful. Starts making a list of all these other sins. You know what this problem is? You know what this guy's deal is? He has a holier than thou attitude. And when you start having a holier than thou attitude, it's a problem. We need to avoid this attitude if we're going to talk to our neighbors. If we're going to tell them about Jesus, if we're going to preach to them the gospel, then we're going to have to make sure we don't have a holier than thou attitude like this Pharisee. Because when you can start convincing and persuading yourself that you are in accordance with these high standards that God has set out for you, then you begin to treat others as if they will never live up to your expectations. That's a problem. No one can meet the expectation that you have set. With this holier than thou attitude, you begin to say things like, thank God I'm not like this guy. Thank God I don't do what they do. Thank God I don't have those sins. At least I don't do that. And you just fill in the blank of whatever sin that is. Or at least I do these things. At least I go to church. At least I show up. These people over here, they don't even go to church. They're mowing their yard on Sunday morning. That's a problem. At least I'm not like this guy. Then the Pharisee starts saying, well, I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all that I have. You know what's interesting about this is the law actually did not require you to fast twice a week. And I don't know. I know I have never fasted twice in 1 week. I don't think I have anyway, unless I just forgot to eat and I got hangry later on. But, I've never fasted like that. But you know what? The way that fasting works in the New Testament is if someone did fast, you wouldn't even know about it. You shouldn't even know about it. No one should go around saying, look, I'm fasting, and I fast twice a week. I'm fasting and I'm fasting. No, the Bible tells us that if you're fasting, that you go ahead and you wash your face up and you act like you're not fasting so that no one even realizes it. No one needs to know, because why? It's between you and God. It is a spiritual renewal between you and God, and no one needs to know about it. And here this Pharisee is praying out to God, and he says, look, man, boy, I'm glad I'm not like this guy. At least I fast twice a week. But the law never required that. The law actually required you to fast once a year, according to the book of Leviticus. Once a year you would fast. This guy's saying, I'm fasting twice a week. You see how much of a holier than thou attitude this fella has? He thinks he's better than everybody else because he's doing more than what the law required and making fun of everybody else that's not. And then he says, I give a tenth of all that I have. Which really, what's so funny, according to the book of Deuteronomy, in the law, all that was required is that you would give a tenth of certain things. Not a tenth of everything, but there were certain things that you should give, set aside 10% to give to God. Now we understand that that 10% is not necessarily, okay, I've counted down to the penny of 10% and now I'm going to give it to God. The idea is that you're giving sacrificially to God, which God expects that from us even today, that we give sacrificially. But no one should go around saying, look, I'm giving a tenth of everything that I got. Look how great and righteous and holier I am than you. Oh, we can't have this kind of attitude if we're going to talk to our neighbors. If we're going to talk to our neighbors, then we're going to have to talk to our neighbors with the way that Jesus says to do it in verse 14. Notice what he says. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. It's very important to see these two words right here, exalted and humbled. Exalted literally means to raise up, and humbled means to lower. And Jesus says that if we'll go ahead and lower ourselves, God will raise us up. But if we begin to raise ourselves up, God will humble us. And He'll put us in our place. So we've got to make sure that we are talking to our neighbors with an attitude of humility. Otherwise, you're being arrogant about yourself and you're being judgmental towards others. You're being judgmental towards others. And that's another one. That's another one that we've got to avoid. If I'm going to talk to my neighbors who sin differently than me, that I've got to make sure that I am not talking to my neighbor with an unmeasured judgment. Go over with me to Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. Here is Luke's recording of the Sermon on the Mount as Matthew records it in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And here he's been talking about loving your enemies. He's telling them, how they should live and how they need to be merciful as their Father is merciful. Matter of fact, he says that, verse 36. It's the catalyst. It's what sets the stage for what he's going to say in verse 37. He says, be merciful even as your Father is merciful. Now, I love the way that the Bible is written. I love patterns, and the Bible is full of patterns. And it's helpful when you see a pattern to notice that, because it helps us to understand the whole passage when there's a pattern. And there's a pattern right here, and I'm going to show it to you right now. We'll examine the passage and make this point. The pattern is this. I want you to notice how a word is used, and then the word is used again. But it's flipped, it's twisted, it's moved to a different way. Notice this. He says, be merciful, there's one word, even as your Father is merciful. So we are to show mercy in the same way that God shows mercy. Now he goes on. Keep reading with me, verse 37. Judge not, and you will not be judged. You see this pattern there. Condemn not, and you will also not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with here it is, measure you use, it will be measured back to you. I love this. I love the pattern that's found where a word is used and then it's used again, but it's placed upon somebody else. That helps us to understand what Jesus is talking about right here. The idea is that we need to show compassion. That's what this word merciful is. Compassion on others. That we judge not. And this word judge is an important word in the New Testament. It's this Greek word krino. Krino. And it's found all throughout the New Testament. Matthew uses it an enormous amount in his gospel. And Luke records it here for us. This word krino. It means to pass judgment, to make a decision about something or someone. Okay? So he's telling us, do not pass judgment, and you will not have judgment passed on you. And I love this because of the context in which Jesus is using this word. It's in the negative sense, that we would not be too judgmental or too critical. And that's a key word for us, because the way that Jesus uses this word in just a moment really points this out to us. Notice what he says in just a moment. Let's keep reading. He gives them this dialogue of how they should be, and then he tells them this parable in verse 39. He says, "Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take that speck out that is in your eye,' when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye?" And then Jesus says this, "You hypocrite." This word hypocrite is coming from the same root word as the word judge. Hypocrino. You hear that? Hypocrite. Hypocrite. All right? And this word hypocrite is so simple to understand. A hypercritical person. Hypercritical. The word literally means that you always have an answer, or that you act. You act a certain way even though you're not that way. You put on a show for everybody else. And so in this context, Jesus is using these words, judge and hypocrite, in the negative sense. In the negative sense. And he's telling us not to be too critical. Don't be too critical. Avoid making an unmeasured judgment. Because when you have passed judgment upon someone else or upon their sins, then you've made a decision about their sins and about the punishment that they should receive. Well, then you're being too critical of your neighbor and their sins. And guess what? That's not your job. My grandfather used to say, "Alex, you're not the manager of the whole universe." I appreciate that so much, because sometimes we try to manage everything and there's things that are just out of our control. Another aspect of that is I am not the manager of your sins. I'm not the one that's supposed to sit there and check off if you've done what's right or what's wrong. That's not my job. My job is not that. And I need to avoid that. Instead, I need to be merciful as my Father is merciful. Verse 36. Because the mercy that you give to someone else will be given to you. Verse 38. And if you are judgmental towards your neighbor, then you will be judged just as harsh. Just as harsh. Don't be judgmental. Don't pass judgment. Don't be hypercritical towards your neighbor. I love this parable about the speck and the log in somebody's eye. I hate getting things in my eye. Oh man, it's the worst. I think it's the worst injury. When Rachel was just a little bitty baby, I was a youth minister in Kansas, and I would take Mondays off, and I get to keep this new little baby on Mondays. And I was holding her one day, and I'm holding her, and she's got these sweet little fingers, and she's touching my face and everything. And then she's also got these razor sharp fingernails. And she reaches up and she scratches my eye. And it hurt, but it really wasn't that bad. But then later that night, when I'm trying to rest, I did not rest at all that night. Not at all. Matter of fact, I was this close to Kira taking me to the hospital. I know, it's just an eye scratch. I get it. but it wouldn't stop. I needed some relief. So finally the next day I actually go to an eye doctor and I have him look at that eye and see what's going on because it had just swelled up. And he said, Alex, you have scratched the epithelials that are on your eye. Just the skin nerves that are on the surface of the eye have been removed. And so every time you blink or every time your eye moves, it just re-pulls the skin away from that eye. Oh, it was terrible. He gave me some eye drops and gave me some pain reliever, and finally I was able to be healed from all that. I hate something in my eye. I hate an injury. Can you imagine a speck being in your eye? It would be terrible. But then a log, and that's the sins that we have. You think about this little thing that your neighbor is dealing with, but because you are a hypocrite and because you are judgmental, you're looking at that little thing that they've got in their eye, and that's something that needs to be addressed, but you've got this beam that's sticking out of your eye. You need to mind your own self. Mind your own self. Take care of your own sins first. That's what Jesus says. Take care of those things first. Then you can help your brother out. Otherwise, you're acting hypocritical. You're putting on a show. You're being too judgmental. And to be judgmental is to be a hypocrite. And to be a hypocrite is to be hypercritical of your neighbor, of everyone else, while not considering your own sins. Instead, if I'm going to talk to my neighbor, I have got to make sure that I'm doing it with mercy. Talk with mercy towards my neighbor who sins differently than me. Yeah. Now listen, we need to point out, mistakes. We need to point out sins for people. There's nothing wrong with saying this is wrong and this is right. We have a job to do. But the Bible also tells us that we do this in such a way that is going to win souls. We do this in such a way that is pleasing. Paul tells the Galatians in Galatians chapter 6, the very beginning of it, he says that you who are spiritual restore such a one who is in sin, who trespasses, in a spirit of gentleness. Paul also tells the Ephesians in chapter 4 in verse 15 that we are to speak the truth in love. So here's your do. Are you ready? Do speak to your neighbor about truth and with love. And so he says in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, he says, rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way unto Him who is the head, unto Christ. Yeah, I can go ahead and correct you, and I can go ahead and point out things that need to be improved upon, things that you need to fix, sins in your life, but I have to do it in such a way that they hear the truth and they don't hear the judgment. They don't hear the holier than thou attitude. They hear the gospel. And the only way that we can proclaim the gospel in an effective way is if we do it in love. Because that's exactly the way that God has done it for us. In Romans chapter 5, Paul says, God demonstrated His own love towards us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Oh, I get emotional with that passage because I think about my own sins, and yet still God shows me, He demonstrates His love to me. And that while I'm still a sinner, Christ died for me. He knew I was going to sin, and 2,000 years earlier, He died on the cross so that my sins can be washed away. That's love. God has been speaking the truth in love from the very beginning. Let's not mess it up for Him. And let's keep that message going. Let's talk to our neighbors with truth and love. It's so important. Let me tell you something though. If we're going to talk to our neighbors, we're going to have to do it with a sense of urgency. A sense of urgency. We can't wait any longer. Not at all. It's so important. We can't wait. There's nothing more important for us to do on this earth than to preach the gospel. And so we can't wait any longer. I want you to turn over to the book of John in chapter 4. I love this because I think that the gospel is the most important thing that we could do. And it's one that we've got to go ahead and just get to the point about. I say that because I have a book that I've had in my library a long time. It is a book called Getting to the Point, The Gospel Point. It's written by a man named Larry West. Larry West actually spoke for our family day just a few years ago. And Larry y'all know Duck Dynasty, right? Y'all know those people. Larry is the father-in-law to Jace Robertson, one of the Duck men. He attends at the Whites Ferry Road Church of Christ in West Monroe, Louisiana. Larry West went around the country doing We Care campaigns. And I think, if my memory serves me correctly, I attended one when I was a kid in Morrilton. There was a time period when my family lived in Russellville, and I think there was a We Care campaign underneath a tent in a field, and they were teaching the gospel and preaching and baptizing people all over that area. I think I attended that We Care campaign in Morrilton, and I remember Larry West being there. Well, this book, Getting to the Point, The Gospel Point, helps us to see that there comes a point in our relationship with our neighbors that we have got to get to the point. We're real good about talking about how we want to do evangelism, and we're real good about saying, well, I need to build a relationship up with this neighbor of mine. I need to build a relationship with my coworker, and I want to show them that I love them. I want to set it a good example. Well, listen, there comes a point that you just got to go ahead and tell them the gospel. There comes a point where you can't just always set a good example. You got to take it a step further and tell them the good news of Jesus. That's what this book is about. You're going to have to get to the point, the gospel point. I love it because there's all kinds of great illustrations, comics actually. And he shows you how to have a conversation with your neighbors. It's a fantastic book. I've read it many times. I have preached probably every lesson that's in this book. I love it that much. Maybe even word for word. Just stole it right out of here because it's so good. So good. We have got to learn that when we're talking to our neighbors, that we have a sense of urgency. Now, let's go to John chapter 4 and see what Jesus says about it. In the context, if you remember, Jesus has been speaking to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And he's been telling her that there's going to come a day when there's no Jew or Gentile in God's kingdom. There's no Samaritans and there's no Jews. Yeah, the Samaritans worship over here and the Jews are worshiping over here on this mountain. But there's going to come a day where all of them are all together in one place. And it's not even about the proximity. It's not about the geographical place. It's about being in the kingdom of God all over the world. And he says that God is spirit and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. He tells her all kinds of terrible things that she's done wrong, the people that she's been with, the husbands that she's had, and he points out these sins to her, and he corrects her. She goes off and she starts telling all the neighborhood people all about this person, this man who has told her all the things pertaining to her life. And she says, he's not the Christ, is he? Well, the answer is yes, absolutely he is the Christ. Well, all this news gets spread all over this town. And the outcome is that many Samaritans believe and they start following Jesus. But right before that verse tells us that, there's this little dialogue. It's a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. And he takes it as a teaching moment for them. And they come to him and they tell him, hey, are you hungry? It's time to eat something. And Jesus says, I've got my own food. And they look and they say, did anybody bring him anything to eat? Because I didn't. Did you fix a bologna sandwich for Jesus? I didn't fix one. Maybe you brought him something. Did you fix him a bowl of cereal? I didn't. No? All right, so what's this food that he's talking about? Well, Jesus explains it. And he says that his food is to do the will of the Father, to preach the gospel. He has a mission, and he is being sustained. He is getting sustenance from doing the will of the Father. I'll do God's will. That's how I'm going to be fed. And then he says this in verse 35. Do you not say there are yet 4 months and then comes the harvest? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. Oh, it's a beautiful passage. Jesus is telling us there's a sense of urgency. Too many times we're telling ourselves that I'll teach my neighbor later on. I got to do this and I got to do that, and the timing just is not right. I've got plenty of time. The harvest is not till like 4 months from now. Things are just now sprouting up out of the ground. God, I planted and God watered, and God will get. This person's watered and then God gives the increase. We start rationalizing in our minds about where we're at in the evangelistic cycle. And Jesus says, lift up your eyes and look and see this great opportunity that's ahead of you, where you can be evangelistic and do the will of the Father. That's how you will be sustained. You preach the gospel. Gary Rhodes was telling me, I preached this sermon this morning at 8 o'clock, and Gary was telling me afterwards that at Harding, Neil Pryor was talking about this passage. And Neil made the point that when Jesus was saying this, that at the time that the crops were not even coming up. It was 4 months until the harvest. That maybe they were just now sprouting up. That it wasn't really even time to go out to the fields to pick. But that these Samaritans, after hearing about this woman and this dialogue between her and Jesus, they start coming down to listen to Jesus, and they're all dressed in white. And so Jesus says, look up, lift up your eyes. The harvest is white. Bluntly, perfectly pointing out that the harvest is right there with these people that need to be reached. Too many times we're letting our neighbor come in and come out of our lives, and we have yet to even talk to them about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that is a problem, my friends. We have got to have a sense of urgency. We've got to go ahead and get to the point, the gospel point. Don't waste your time anymore. The time is now. Lift up your eyes and see it. That's how you talk to your neighbor. That's how you do it. Talk to your neighbor. Yes, they sin differently than us. Sure. But they're probably looking at you and thinking that you sin differently than they do. And that's okay. We understand that there is differences in consequences of sin, but sin is the same. And so what do we need to do? We don't need to have, if we're going to talk to our neighbor, we don't need to have a holier-than-thou attitude. Because if we do, then we're being too judgmental. So don't have an unmeasured judgment towards my neighbor. But do talk to them about truth with love. And do it with a great sense of urgency. We all probably have people in our lives that we need to reach. People that we love, people that need to hear the gospel. They may be in your own family. They may be in your friend group. They may be your neighbor literally. Don't take any more time. Go talk to them. Get to the point, the gospel point, with your neighbor and talk to them. We can do these things. Well, I hope this has been encouraging to you. I'm so excited about the other things that we will address. Some of them will be, how do I talk to my neighbor who worships different than me? How do I talk to my neighbor who believes different than me? And those two things are different. Sometimes someone may believe in God, but they worship different than I do. How do I talk to my denominational friends? How do I do that? How do I be evangelistic to them? How do I talk to somebody, my neighbor who does not even believe in God, who believes different than me? How do I talk to my neighbor who is on a different socioeconomic status than I am? Maybe my neighbor is richer than I am. Maybe my neighbor is more poor. How do I talk to them? How do I reach them? Finally, I think around October, there'll be a conclusion sermon that will say, we'll talk about how to talk to my neighbor without turning them off. It stems from a sermon that I gave years ago, a lesson I gave years ago at Youth Outreach University that was started in Conway, Arkansas. I gave a lesson on how to talk to my friends without turning them off. I'm going to preach that. I'm going to give you that lesson. It's been almost 20 years, but it's a good one. How do I talk to my neighbor without turning them off? I'm so excited about it. If anything, I'm hoping that it just encourages you to be evangelistic and to talk to your neighbor. And you talk to your neighbor. Why? Because you love your neighbor. You love them. And you want them to be in heaven with you. You want them to make it. You want them to serve God. You want them to be a part of you and your church. You want to have that camaraderie and that unity. You love your neighbor. And so you talk to them. This morning, I've not presented the gospel to you. I've not told you about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. I've talked a little bit about sin, and maybe you can look at that list that we saw and you see where you've sinned, and you need to be forgiven for it. You need to repent. Maybe you need to repent openly and publicly this morning. And this church family, If there's anything that this church family is good at, is showing you love and showing you how we're in this together and not judgmental. And we can do that. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation by being baptized or to restore yourself back into the fold of God's church, come as together we stand and as we sing.